Our scripture reading this morning, if you'd like to follow along, it's out of Exodus chapter 20. We read this last week, and we will read it again next week, a different part of it. The Ten Commandments, and we're going to look at the first four. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000th generations to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. When you look at the picture up there, what do you see? How many of you see two black faces looking at each other? How many of you see a white vase? Now, how many of you are seeing both of them switching back and forth the more you stare at it? That is an example of ambiguous. Now, we don't typically like ambiguous things, which means that it's capable of being understood in more than one way. What I'm going to propose to us today is that the Ten Commandments are ambiguous, and that they are intentionally ambiguous. That when God gave the Ten Commandments to us through Moses, as part of being apodictic law, they are written in such a way as that they can be understood in more than one way. Now, do not hear that as meaning that the Ten Commandments are vague or that they are uncertain. They are not vague. They are not uncertain. What this ambiguity does is that's what keeps the Ten Commandments relevant to the culture in which we live today, because they are a living thing. They're not dead. They are a living commandment that continues to have an impact and should have an impact upon our life today. Part of the ambiguity then means that the Ten Commandments make us think. God, if he wanted to have made robots, could have made us robots. But he gave us minds because we are created in the image of God. And so he expects us to be in a relationship with him and to think and to have this give and take as to what it is that God wants to be doing in our lives and how he wants us to be living. So we're going to look at the first four of the Ten Commandments. The first four Ten Commandments deal with our relationship with God. Then we'll look at the next six commandments, 5 through 10, and those deal with relationships to other people and to property. And so we'll look at those next week. Now, the first commandment then is, you shall have no other gods before me. Now, the one part about the Ten Commandments which has absolutely no ambiguity is the fact that they say no. 8 out of the 10 of the Ten Commandments are a negative. Thou shalt not, or you shall not, which reminds me of the poster. Which part of the word no don't you understand? That is not ambiguous at all. But there is something ambiguous in each and every one of these commandments. There'll be a word or a phrase which can be understood in different ways. And so the word that is ambiguous in the first commandment is other gods. Other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. What does that mean? The word that's used there in the Hebrew is Elohim, which is disturbing for us because in Genesis there are two words that are used for the name of God, Adonai and Elohim. Elohim is the most common one, and so it seems weird that he would be using the same word Elohim in contrast to Yahweh, to the Lord. And so he says that there are no other Elohims. You shall have no other Elohims but me. So what does that mean? Well, this first commandment is telling us four things. It tells us, first off, that it prescribes a relationship rather than an act. This is the only commandment which doesn't tell us a behavior to do or not to do. It tells us that we are to be in a relationship with the Lord, with Yahweh. Secondly, this is a commandment that is attached to the character of God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, who delivered you out of Egypt. And so this command is linked to this deliverance of a God who loves us and cares for us. And by extension, God has delivered us from sin and death through Jesus Christ. And so by extension, God is a deliverer to us. It's to who we have to love and to care for. Thirdly, and this is the most important part of the first commandment, is that it calls for an exclusive loyalty to God and God alone. If you get anything else out of the first commandment, this is what it is. It calls for an exclusive loyalty to God. So now the question then, and the ambiguous part, is what are these other gods? What is he referring to that he says, you shall have no other gods before me? Well, these other gods that he's referring to are not divine beings. Later in Exodus, and particularly then in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God will refine this statement where he will say, there are no other gods besides me. But there are things in our life, aren't there, which take the role of God. Now, we oftentimes will call these priorities, and I don't want you to hear priorities as being a negative thing here, okay? Because your family is a priority. Your work is a priority. But where they become a problem is when they become your first loyalty. When these things become what it is that you treasure. As we looked at a couple weeks ago in chapter 19, when God first makes this covenant with the people of Israel on Mount Sinai, he says to the people of Israel, you are my treasure. You are my unique treasure. He says that you are to be a kingdom of priests and to be a holy nation. And what God desires for us is to treasure him. And when we don't treasure him, that's when we begin to violate the first commandment. And so what this commandment, I jumped ahead of myself here, so what this commandment is asking us is, what do I treasure? What do you treasure? Do you treasure God, or do you treasure other things? So the first commandment is saying, you shall not have these other treasures before me, which have become God's. Second, you shall not make for yourself an idol. Here's how the rest of it goes. You shall not bow down to them or to worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation for those who hate me. In the second commandment, we have gone from you shall not have to you shall not make. That you shall not make. The ambiguous word that is found in the second commandment is the Hebrew word pesel, which we translate as image, replica. And so the ambiguous part of this is, what does pesel, image, mean? That I should not make an image of these other gods that we looked at in the first commandment, these gods of Babylon and Egypt, Canaan? Or am I not permitted to make an image of Yahweh, the Lord? Now, in all likelihood, in Moses' day, the word pesel makes a whole lot more sense if it is making images or replicas out of gold and silver of the gods of Egypt and Canaan and Babylon. The reason why that makes sense is because God says you shall not make an image out of anything that's in the heavens, that's in the earth below, that's in the oceans, because I am a jealous God. And why would God be jealous of an image of himself? It makes no sense in that particular understanding. And so in Moses' day, most likely what this was referring to was worshiping other gods and worshiping a replica of those other gods, whether they're Cain or Baal or any of these other things that are out there. It is worship that belongs to God, which is being transferred to another. But in our culture, we don't worship Canaanite gods or Egyptian gods. We don't Indian gods or those things. We don't have our idols that we bow down to. So in our culture today, it's the second aspect of that commandment which is most relevant for us. And that is trying to make an image of Yahweh. Now, images are like cartoon portraits, okay? When you draw a cartoon portrait, you emphasize some traits and you de-emphasize other traits. And no matter how flattering that portrait looks, it's always a distortion, isn't it? Anytime you try to make an image of God, it's going to be distorted. And it's not going to be truth. Later in Israel's history, I'm going to read this in just a couple of weeks, is when they made the golden calf. You remember when they make the golden calf thing and then Moses comes down off the mountain and breaks the tablets and stuff like that? The golden calf was a flattering image to the Hebrews. It was a sign of virility and strength. And yet God becomes very angry because it's a distortion as to who he is. God does not reveal himself, has not revealed himself in things of which we could make an image. He doesn't reveal himself as an animal. He doesn't reveal himself as a superhuman type thing. And so there is no image of him of which we can create. And so he says, don't try to make an image out of anything that's in the sky or that's in the earth or that's in the sea below. But what we're trying to do when we make an image of Yahweh, and again, this doesn't really seem to fit for us because we don't make statues and idols and those sorts of things. But the real issue here has to do with control. There are two types of images here. You have conventional form versus real form. I'll try not to be real confusing here, but a flag, wherever our United States flag is, a flag is a conventional form. It is not the United States, but it represents the United States. When you see the flag, what do you think of? United States. Okay? A real image or idol is not just a replica, it's the real thing. He who has the idol has the God and controls the God. He who has a flag just has a flag. You don't have the country. I don't control the country because I'm waving a flag. But he who has the idol has the God and controls the God. You see the difference in where this is going? Israel fell into this trap. They had the Ark of the Covenant, and when we get to the tabernacle, we're going to look at this Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant was a conventional form. It was not God. It just represented that God's presence was found in the people of Israel. But later, Israel begins to see the Ark of the Covenant not as being a conventional form, but as being the real form. They began to think that God actually lived or dwelt in the box. So consequently, when they were in battles, they would take the Ark of the Covenant, the box of God, with them into battle in order to control God to fight for them. And they lose. God lets the Ark of the Covenant be captured because God does not live in the box. The problem for us is although we don't actually make gold or silver objects or have a box of God, we nonetheless want to be in control of God, don't we? Ideally, we make ourselves God so that I can be in control. But we want to control God, and we try to control God by our offerings. We try to control God by our prayers. We try to control God by the way we live our life, somehow thinking that if I do these certain things, which is like bowing down before an idol, I can obligate God to do what I need Him and want Him to do for me. Dr. Dennis Kinlaw, who's the past president of Asbury University, writes, the first two commandments tell us about proper worship. If we mess up here, we have the potential to mess up at other places. The test of a true believer is not what you do with commandments 3 through 10, but what you allow the God of the first 2 commandments to do with your life. That makes sense? Or am I losing you as to what's happening with these first 2 commandments? 3rd commandment then. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord. This is the commandment that has more variances in the English translation than all of the other commandments. There are more differences in this one than any of the others. Here's just some examples of this. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, King James Version. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, International Version. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, New Revised Standard. Do not use my name for evil purposes, today's English version. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. I have no idea what the NJPS translation stands for. And you are not to take up the name of Yahweh your God for emptiness, a translation by Edward Fox. Different things. And so what's going on here? The ambiguous word that we find in this commandment is the Hebrew word lasoe, which can be translated as frivolous or falsely. And so what this commandment is dealing with, it's actually 4 things. I only have 3 on the power slide here, but there's actually 4 things. Is that what lasoe can be referring to is perjury, making a false oath that you know isn't true. It's when you would say, I swear to God, and then you, of course, don't actually mean what you say, but I swear to God. So that's a false oath. It's trivializing, to strip the name of God of its holiness. That's what happens when we say things like, oh my God. You see her hair? Oh my God. Or we use, just that, take God's name and just use it casually as though it has no meaning whatsoever. This is also where cussing comes in. In our Alpha course that we've been doing with the youth for confirmation, we've noticed that it's only God's name or Jesus' name that we use as cuss words. If you stub your toe, nobody ever yells SpongeBob SquarePants. Which is actually, I shouldn't have dropped an SB on you there, I'm sorry. Which actually make more sense. But it's when we take God's name and we cuss with it. You dishonor it when you do that. Thirdly, to curse doesn't mean cussing here. It means to use the name of God to harm others. Put a curse upon them. Which is, when you actually hear the phrase, God damn it, you are putting a curse upon them. Now, there is an appropriate time to use that phrase, by the way. When you see extreme evil, by all means, we should curse that God would damn that behavior, that sort of a thing. But to just drop GDs on people because you're upset or frustrated because, you lost a football game or something, that's inappropriate. The 4th one, this is the one I should have added, and I was going to add it this morning, is that you can also use God's name falsely if you think that by knowing the name of God, you have control over God. In ancient cultures, it was thought, he who has the name of God controls God. He who has the idol of God controls God. And so it fits with all of these 3 previous ones that we have been looking at. So Dr. Vicar Hamilton, this is what he writes about the 3rd commandment. The 3rd commandment cautions against using the Lord's name falsely to buttress a truth claim that is fabricated. By extension, it prohibits any use of the holy name that is without any real significance, any trivializing of the tetragrammaton, the YHWH, those 4 letters. He goes on to say, I'm not sure whether biblical Israel has any concept of cussing or using a collection of 4-letter words, but it is not a misunderstanding of this commandment to bring it to bear on the pervasive use today of, oh my God, in every imaginable situation. So if you have an emoji on your cell phone for OMG, you're violating the third commandment, taking the Lord's name and making it frivolous, vain. Alexander the Great had a soldier one time who was brought to him. He was brought to him for disorderly conduct, cowardice, and dereliction of duty. And so Alexander the Great, he asks this soldier and he says, "What's your name?" And this young man sneered at him and he said, "Alexander." At which point Alexander the Great struck him and knocked him to the ground, screamed at him to get up. When he got up, he hit him again and knocked him to the ground. And then he shouted at this young man and he says, "Either change your behavior or change your name." Either change your behavior or change your name. If we're going to claim the name of Christ, we are going to use the name of God, we need to either change our behavior or disassociate ourselves from the use of the name. The last one we're going to look at today. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. This is the first positive commandment. The fifth commandment, which we'll look at next week, is the second positive commandment. It's not written in the negative, but it's written in a positive commandment. And it says, remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. This is the oldest or second oldest of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not murder might be the oldest because we know that Cain and Abel, God was upset about that, and he asked Cain, and he says, where's your brother? And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And also with Noah, he gives the introduction of capital punishment for if you kill somebody. But the 10th commandment, this commandment, the fourth commandment of keeping the Sabbath, is at least the second oldest, and it predates the Ten Commandments. And that when they were making their way towards Mount Sinai and they get the manna, God is instructing them that you can't collect the manna on the seventh day because you're supposed to rest. You're not supposed to be out working, and you're supposed to be trusting me. But this commandment is the most controversial, and it's the one that we violate. We say that we want to keep the 10 Commandments. We only keep 9. We do not keep the fourth commandment of remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. And we make all kinds of excuses as to why we violate this commandment. The importance of this commandment is we are told to sanctify it or to make it holy. That means that remembering the Sabbath is not just taking a day off. It's more than just taking a day off. If all God wanted was for us to take a day off, he wouldn't have specified the specific day and exactly what it is that we were supposed to be doing, which is not working. God could have said, okay, well, Saturday is a day off for the men, and Sunday will be a day off for the women, and Monday will be a day off for the slaves and livestock, and Tuesday will be a day off for the kid. But he doesn't do that. He says a specific day. He says that the Sabbath day, the seventh day, is to be a day of rest, and it is to model what God has done for us. And that God created the first 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. And so if God is not a workaholic, neither should we be a workaholic. And the purpose of the Sabbath is in order that we might rest and that we might orient our life around God and to accept the sovereignty of God. That was what the whole deal with the manna was. Is that I am providing for you, so I will give you twice as much manna on the 6th day, so that you don't have to go out and work on the 7th day to trust me. But we don't trust God. We think that if I don't work, that it all relies upon me, and that if I don't work, that God's not going to provide for me, and he's not going to care for me. So to keep Sabbath is to accept God's sovereignty in our life. Now, here's the deal. Sunday is not a Christian Sabbath. Now, we'd like it to be, but it's not. Sunday is described as being the first day, the 8th day, the 3rd day, the day of resurrection, but it is never called the 7th day. It's never called the 7th day. Saturday is the 7th day. The ambiguous part, then, is what is meant by work. What are we not supposed to do? We're not supposed to to work. Now, the Jews have something like 15,000 listings under this law as to what is prohibited. If you walked a certain distance, when you walked one extra step, that made it work, whereas before it wasn't work. If you made a fire, that was considered to be work. If you go to Israel today and you go into a kosher apartment building, on Saturday, the elevator will automatically stop at every floor so that you don't have to push the button, which is considered starting a fire. Now, we think this is nonsense, of course, with all of this nitpicking as to what it is that means work. But that's how serious the Jews, practicing Jews, tried to keep Sabbath. Jesus violated Sabbath because he healed on the Sabbath. That was where a great deal of the controversy was, is that he would heal on the Sabbath, and they would say, come on the other days. This was a day of rest. You know, come and let Jesus heal you on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, but not upon the Sabbath day. And Jesus' response to this is that it is okay to do good on the Sabbath, and that Sabbath was made for human beings, not the other way around, not human beings for the Sabbath. But Jesus was an observant Jew. We forget that. We like to think of Jesus as being a good Republican American, don't we? Although I don't even think Jesus would vote for Donald Trump, but we'll just think that on the other way around. Right? Forget I said that. But Jesus was an observant Jew. He observed Sabbath. He rested. What keeping Sabbath means is to orient one's life around God. To orient one's life around God and to accept that one day of rest that God gives you. Put that aside. Keeping Sabbath is how we observe the first 3 commandments. It means that we put God first. Rather than my idols, my priorities, thinking that I have to work or do all of these things. It is doing away with idols because I'm not trying to control God, but I'm allowing God to be in control of me. It's accepting God's sovereignty, and it's honoring God's holy name. By keeping Sabbath, we make it holy. That's what happens when we do that. Feel real guilty now? I do. Yeah, I feel really bad. Now, I'm not ready to be a Seventh-day Adventist yet because they do so much stuff that's distorting of the Scriptures. But nonetheless, what are we to do? If possible, you need to observe Sabbath, and you need to observe it on Saturday. Now, what's more important? The resting part or the Saturday part? I think the resting part is more important than the actual Saturday part. So if your work prohibits you from being able to take Saturday off, you need to find a day where you orient your life around God. Now, does that mean I'll have to keep all these 15,000 restrictions of not being able to push an elevator button or all those sorts of things? No, I don't think we're obligated to keep all of that. But the key thing is, are you resting? Are you trusting God for this day? Or are you trusting yourself and trying to control God? God was not a workaholic. We should not be a workaholic. It's to orient our life around what God has done. It's not to be legalistic, but to be a blessing. That's the point. All of these commandments are not to be seen as being legalistic, that God somehow is saying to you that all of these things are fun and I don't want you to have fun. Just the opposite. God is giving us these 10 commandments in order to bless us, in order that we might be in a proper relationship with Him, thus be in a proper relationship with other people and a proper relationship with our property. So here are the first 4 commandments. Keep God first. Don't try to control God, either by making idols or by misusing His name or by just thinking that somehow you can control and manipulate God. Don't misuse, trivialize, or use God's name to harm others. 4th, acknowledge God's sovereignty by resting. Now, my confession to you is that working on this sermon this past week, I took yesterday off. I hadn't done that in a long time. Usually after I come to men's breakfast, I go into my office and I work until 12, 1 o'clock or so, polishing up the sermon and doing other things. Yesterday I rested. Didn't mean I just sat around and watched football, although I did do a lot of that. But I spent that time orienting my life around God. Now, if given the opportunity to serve somebody, I would have. To do good on the Sabbath. But I wasn't going to allow financial concerns and worries dictate my day. Are you going to keep 10 commandments? Or are you only going to keep 9? Let's pray.